while this is partisan driven, and we've seen Republican legislators get elected into office and then try to rig the system through crazy redistricting, through making it harder for communities to vote, and knowing that there's a campaign finance system where the richest and biggest corporations are going to fund them, and they want that to flood out the popular vote. There are also organizations like ALEC that are state networks that are corporate funded that help write the laws for the legislators, and they have them on this shelf, and we've been able to see, in some cases, the exact same language. In a couple cases, they even forget to change the name of the state from one to the other when they're submitting the same laws. So there's a series and a pattern about making it harder to vote early, harder to vote by mail, harder to register, harder for young people to register where they are, and elements of the ID and other things that they know disproportionately affect certain communities.
Who else has questions?
Yes.
When did you say this started? And also before then, I guess what did people need to bring to vote before you didn't need an ID? You know?
Well, I think this goes back all the way to the founding of the nation itself, when there was an effort to restrict women from voting, people who didn't own property from voting. And we have seen the progress of America being a progress of expanding the franchise, expanding the right to vote. And that's been part of our national character, is to understand that that's part of what we're about, is expanding that franchise to be more inclusive over time, not less. Those laws took different forms through history, in efforts most notably in the South, but really all over the country. In the famous Jim Crow era, once the Voting Rights Act had come through, or once the voting amendments had gone through, to make it next to impossible. Literacy tests, poll tests, putting police officers in an intimidating way by poll sites, every manner imaginable to make it harder for certain communities to vote. And again, the great American tradition has been to fight back against those and make sure that every American lives out that idea that we are equal under the law, and have the equal pursuit of happiness, of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So I think it's always been going on. What you saw, though, is that the side of justice has been winning over the side of oppression. The side of inclusiveness and equality has been winning over the side of restriction. And this is one of the first real moves backwards we've seen in that process. And that process began really in various forms from, we've seen a lot of it pick up just in the last 15 years. There was an effort from 1992 forward when one of the first real youth vote coalitions was put together that helped impact the election in Bill Clinton's favor in 1992, that you saw a response from Republicans saying we got to make it harder for young people to vote because they seem to be, when they actually come out and speak, they affect the outcome of elections. And so there was this effort to say, okay, well, people, we're gonna scare them and say, oh, you might lose your financial aid if you're voting here, there, anything to sort of get people kind of confused, and there's no way they're going to take a train all the way home to vote, etc. So I think you really saw a pickup in it at that point. Again, you saw these nonpartisan efforts to make it easier and easier for people to vote, which again is what we should want. And the impact, if you look at any poll in America and you ask the American people how they feel, and then you look at most political polls which ask likely voters how they feel, the likely voter poll is almost always several points to the right of the American people because of lower turnout among groups that tend to vote for Democrats and support progressive causes. And so the Republicans looked at that and said, how can we lock that in? How can we reinforce that advantage where this is not representing the American people, but are representing the people that actually make it to the polls, and how can we help define that?
What do you see the role of the courts in this? If I'm not mistaken, I think the voter ID law in Pennsylvania was recently upheld.
So we believe the courts have an enormous role to play in this to make sure that certainly the most egregious discriminatory efforts are dismissed. I was surprised and disappointed in the Pennsylvania ruling, but it is being appealed, and I still believe that at the appellate level, they will look at this and see the clear discriminatory intent of this bill, and will prevent it from being implemented in the fall. So we'll still see the appeal there. Now, Pennsylvania is under a different part of the Voting Rights Act than, say, Virginia is. States that have had more of a history of racial discrimination have to meet a higher standard than others. So you would see even the same law would almost certainly have been overturned, I think, in other states. One of the things that we're very careful to do, we want to make very clear, is we don't just care about this happening in a state like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. It's a swing state. We're looking at states like Alabama, Georgia, and others where this may not be about whether the Democrats or Republicans win that state. It's about the integrity of the system and the fact that every individual has that right to vote, whether or not it affects the outcome of the race. This is about that person standing in the democratic process and being treated with the full dignity of American citizenship. Yes, ma'am.
What would you suggest is the best thing for residents of the states affected by these laws can do to combat or reverse these laws?
So I think there are two very important things that citizens can do. First and foremost is to make sure you're registered as an individual. Find a group that you trust, say it's the League of Women Voters, or the NAACP, or your local Sierra Club or Chamber of Commerce, and make sure that you're registered. And if you have any questions, you go to someone you trust who can help to answer those questions. I think as an individual, we each have an obligation to be part of that democratic process. Second is to team with other citizens to make sure that your state legislators, as well as your federal legislators, understand how outrageous this is, and how this is an issue that Republicans should be just as outraged as Democrats, should be just as outraged as independents. And again, while this discriminatorily hits young people and communities of color, it's also true that any suburban person of any ethnicity or income range should be excited about the idea that they might be able to vote on a weekend and not just on Tuesday. That they might be able to make sure that their parent or their child who's off to college are going to get to vote. So we're all affected by this. And so building those coalitions that show that we're in this together as the American people and we're going to demand this. Sometimes the national media tends to cover the federal things a lot more than they cover state issues. Most of this battle is happening at the state level, not the federal level. And in doing so, we want to make sure that people understand to go to Richmond or Baltimore, I guess, Annapolis, or wherever it is. Failing 5th grade civics about what's the capital of states. Go to your state capitals and make sure that you're building the kind of coalition that can say this is outrageous. There are certain things that should just be agreed on. And one of those seems to be the idea that everybody who has the right to vote, we should be encouraging them to vote, if not making them feel morally obligated to vote, and certainly shouldn't be making it harder to do so. Yes, ma'am.
So, do you believe that this should be a state issue or like a nation issue?
It's a great question. I think it is a state issue first and foremost because that's where it is right now. There is a federal issue with the Voting Rights Act, as we said, where a state has shown that it is incapable or unwilling to protect the right of its own citizens to vote into full citizenship. Then the Department of Justice has a role. So both of those things are there. The federal standard is there in order to make sure where these egregious patterns existed, that we have a right, or the courts have a right, to come in and demand otherwise. I think there's a broader question here, which is whether we have sufficiently protected the fundamental constitutional right to vote that we've talked about, and whether there may be room for greater federal action there. There are a number of issues we haven't talked about here. None of this addresses the issue about former felons having the right to vote. And different states have different standards. Some states are particularly, it's very, very difficult to get one's rights restored. That's traditionally been a state issue. And those are all important conversations